General. And it's time to begin introducing our first panel, Global Security and Peace Through Strength. So the first person I'd like to introduce was the U.S. ambassador to NATO in his past life, but is better known to us here in Chicago and is very dear to our hearts as the former, until very recently, president and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And we're very grateful to him for bringing the world to Chicago for so many years and for joining us here today. He is now a senior fellow at Harvard University, Ambassador Ivo Daalder. Joining him will be another former U.S. diplomat who was ambassador to Russia during the administration of Barack Obama. But to me, as a former student of Russian and East European studies, I will say he is a patron saint of all students and academics in the field, and also someone who has trained a lot of now members of parliament and leaders of Ukraine's kind of both diaspora and the political establishment through his work as a professor and leader of multiple institutions at Stanford University, and that is Ambassador Mike McFaul. Please join us on stage. Also joining us will be the legislative director to Senator Chuck Grassley from a neighboring state, from Iowa. So we are very grateful that in our deep blue democratic Chicago, we have bipartisan representation because we think that supporting Ukraine and freedom in Europe and around the world should be a bipartisan cause. I'd like to introduce James Rice. And lastly, I want to introduce a special guest from Ukraine. She started as an anti-corruption activist, is the parliamentary leader of a liberal party in Ukraine called Holos. She is a member of several key committees, including one overseeing arms deliveries into Ukraine. She's a graduate of the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, Ukraine's oldest university. And US members of Congress have described her as the best advocate that they have met on any cause. She is a credit to her country and, again, a very special guest today. I'd like to introduce Oleksandra Ustinova. Moderating the panel will be the Director of Communications for the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, Andrij Dobriansky.
Доброго ранку всім. Вітаю. What a great panel to start things off with, because global peace and security is probably the easiest thing to talk about, and especially for people we have seated with us, both friends from Ukraine and within the United States. This has probably been the time of year, probably the last week, probably the most you haven't seen your loved ones, or you've been asked your opinion in a party or on camera, pretty much nonstop. And it's unfortunate that all of us gathered here today, we work so hard to include Ukraine in the conversation, whether it's at our festivals or in our advocacy. The Consul General, of course, trying in the off years in between these blow-ups to bring attention to Ukraine. So it's unfortunate that it is during conflict that these voices are heard the most, but it's oftentimes that we can push the chains, as we say in football, a little further during this moment, because as soon as the development began in January and February of 2022, many of us knew that everything that we had learned going up to that moment, it was already in place. So many of the things from those times, for many of us, we thought, okay, let's learn as much as we can right now about what's going right and wrong and what we can apply to the future. In many ways, when we have this discussion, we're going to be talking about developments in Ukraine in 2025 that are radically different than what was on the ground in 2022. Whether you're talking about Russian military equipment, Ukrainian military equipment, the kind of partnerships we have. So with that, we're going to get to our first panel. We're going to go down the line as we are in the program. And Ivo, Ambassador, if you would like to say a couple of words just to start off, and then we'll do questions after.
On? Yeah. Yep, there we go. First of all, thanks so much for inviting me. And the Ukrainian community here in Chicago is a very special community. Chicago's a very special place, but it is a very special place because there is this Ukrainian community that is extraordinary. It loves this country and it loves its country where it came from in equal measure. And I have had, in the 12 years I've been here, the extraordinary fortune of spending a lot of time, to spend a lot of time with the Ukrainian community for unfortunately unfortunate reasons. But soon after I arrived in Chicago in 2013, the war with Russia started. It didn't start in 2022. It started in 2014, and it's been going on for 12 years ever since. I must admit that it was Mike and me had left, and then it went all south. just so that we're not to blame for this. In fact, I was the only U.S. ambassador to NATO when Russia did not invade another country. It invaded Georgia. It invaded Georgia before I got there, and invaded Ukraine after I left. So, again, I don't know why, but that's. I want to make one statement, and in part because of my background. But I want to make one statement, and then explain it in 2 minutes. The statement is, Ukraine should and must become a member of NATO. And I say this with particular reference to what's happened in the last week. If you read the NATO treaty, which unfortunately not too many people do, Article 10 says that any European state can be invited to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization if it adheres to the principles, and most importantly, if it contributes to the security of the North Atlantic area. Ukraine, in the last 3.5 years, and in some ways in the last 12, but certainly in the last 3.5 years, has done more for the security of the North Atlantic area than any other country in the world. Most importantly, more than any of the 32 members of NATO, including the United States of America. And it has done so at a cost to itself that is immeasurable, truly immeasurable, in lives, in memories, in richness, in identity. What has happened in the past 3.5 years is going to be with Ukraine until eternity, forever. But the sacrifice that has been made has directly contributed to the freedom and security of everyone who lives in Europe and everyone who lives in North America, including here in the United States. So why is it so hard for people to believe that Ukraine should be a member of NATO? Not just this president of the United States, but the previous president of the United States opposed NATO membership. Why? Because Russia doesn't like it. At its core, that is what it's about. If Russia were to say, oh, I don't have a problem with NATO membership, Ukraine would have been a member of NATO 15 years ago. But somehow here in the United States, and it's particularly in the United States, our leaders have decided that somehow one of the worst dictators in a century, and certainly the worst dictator in the past 25 years, should have a say about whether a country that has contributed more to the security of the North Atlantic area than any other country should or should not become a member of NATO. This is insane. And we need to say this loud and clear. We should not accept the analysis that have led Joe Biden and Donald Trump to say that Ukraine should not be a member of NATO. We should not accept it. We should push back. And when we are having this debate, as we are now having about security guarantees and all of these questions about what to do, we should make clear there is no such thing as an Article 5 protection or NATO-like security guarantee that is better than NATO membership. So just move forward. There are all kinds of difficulties, but these can be solved. We've been here before. Germany became a member of NATO in 1955, even though it was divided. Norway became a member of NATO in 1949 and said, no, US troops could be there. And they weren't, not on a permanent basis. The East European countries became part of NATO and said there won't be any nuclear weapons on their territory. And that was fine. So there's ways to do this that makes people think that this is doable. But let's start from the proposition that's very simple. When you contribute to the security of the North Atlantic area and you want to become a member of NATO, you should become a member of NATO.
Yeah, for you. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We're going to continue from one ambassador to the next. Fair warning for the panelists. The pandering to Chicago is appreciated, but your host is from New York, so let's not talk pizza, all right? Mr. Ambassador, if you could please.
Well, first, it's a real honor to be here. I know this community. I've never been here before, and it's a real honor to be on this panel. We're not quite where I live in Palo Alto. We don't have quite as many Ukrainian Americans as you do here. But what we have, we do in a very strong way. About 20 years ago at Stanford, I wanted to tell you, we started a program inspired by the Orange Revolution. I wrote a book about that, and afterwards I did a study for USAID about how America had helped democracy in 2004 in Ukraine. And I came back from that study saying, actually, we did a little bit in the margins, but it was Ukrainians who did that on their own, and we created this program to help other people around the world learn from other small D Democrats. And every summer, we're now in the 20th year of that program. We always have a strong group from Ukraine. Sasha is one of the alums of that program. Lyesa Matvichuk, I think, is speaking later today. She's another member of that program, alum of that program. So we're small at Stanford, but Ukraine is a very big part of what we do at the university. So it's great to be here. I just agree for 100%, 110% with everything that Ivo said. He said it so eloquently. So I'm just going to say it again less eloquently. No, let me make 3 points, because peace through strength is one of the themes today. And as a student of diplomacy, as a former practitioner for a little while, but as an American, I just feel shameful that we are not practicing peace through strength with our diplomacy, I would say around the world, but especially with Ukraine today. First and foremost, President Trump, and we can litigate the Biden administration. I'm happy to do that. I've been very critical of many things they did as well. But since President Trump has been in office, there's been no new sanctions whatsoever. There has been no new military or economic assistance package, just a continuation of what was there before. And at the same time that is happening, the attacks on civilians, principally inside Ukraine, has increased. President Trump wants people to forget that, but it's increased under him. That is not peace through strength. That is the opposite. And I do not think that serves our country's national security interests in the long run. If we look weak, that emboldens our enemies, first and foremost Mr. Putin, but not only him. I just think it's weakness in Europe is weakness everywhere. But it's also immoral. And I think we need to talk about morality more here in the United States. This notion that all great powers are the same and it's just a balance of power is completely ridiculous. I believe that the United States has been best served in its 250-year history. In fact, I just wrote a book called Autocrats versus Democrats that starts in the 18th century. You can take your phones and pre-order it right now if you want. No, I'm just joking. But if you look at that history, when we are on the side of right versus wrong, it's better for our national security interests. If we are on the side of democracy versus autocracy, it's better for our national security interests. If we are against imperialism and against annexation and against genocidal war against war crimes is better for our interests. And what really bothers me with President Trump today is he doesn't think or talk in those terms. And I think that weakens America, and it most certainly weakens security in Ukraine and in Europe. My second point, of course, in American diplomacy, including today, it is sometimes necessary to talk to dictators, to talk to autocrats. Sometimes you have to do that. One of my mentors at Stanford was a guy named George Shultz. He was the Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan, and he used to talk about this. He wrote a fantastic book about diplomacy. I think he was one of our greatest diplomats ever. No disrespect, Ambassador Daalder.
Totally agree.
But he said when doing that, he said two very important things, which tragically President Trump did the exact opposite in Alaska. He said, okay, you got to talk to these folks, but you don't have to call them friends, and you don't have to check your values at the door to do so. And what was on display in Alaska was exactly that. And I have to say, it was an embarrassment for me as an American that we treated that indicted war criminal, that imperialist dictator, with that kind of literally rolling out the carpet, literally soldiers on their knees to roll out that carpet for that person. That was completely unnecessary. But the third point, if you're going to engage with dictators and you're going to give them those kinds of meetings, you got to get something out of it. What's so striking to me, almost mysterious to me, for a president that talks about himself as being transactional. You know, he wrote a book, or somebody helped him write a book called Art of the Deal, right? Transactions. Well, in diplomacy, that is important. If you're going to interact, if you're going to give this gift of this summit and all the pageantry to this dictator, you should get something in return. And what was so disappointing from Alaska, not only did my country, our country, if you're an American, not get any tangible benefit for our security, our prosperity, or our values, but the president actually adopted some of the talking points of Putin. That is incredibly ineffective diplomacy. And that leads me to my last point. Monday in Washington was much better. Whosever brilliant idea it was, and I think it was probably a Ukrainian idea, I'm not sure about this. If you know, please tell me. But whosever brilliant idea it was to bring President Zelensky as fast as possible Friday, and he got there on Monday, I congratulate whoever that was. And whosever brilliant idea it was to then bring the Europeans, I applaud that. I was actually quoted by the White House applauding that on Tuesday, and then they said, well, that was President Trump's idea. If it was his idea, I applaud him as well, because that began to correct what I thought was a complete disaster last Friday. But let's be clear. There's been no real progress. As Sasha talked about it, there's been negotiations to begin negotiations. We have yet to start that process. And when, and if, I should say, because I'm not very optimistic about it, but when it happens, there's one last principle that echoes some of the things that Ivo just said that has to be a necessary condition of all these negotiations. We have to separate out debate, conditions, negotiation about the borders between Russia and Ukraine from a debate about security guarantees between Ukraine and Europe and the United States. The first conversation is just between the dictator of Russia and the democratically elected president of Ukraine on behalf of the Ukrainian people. We, including the president of the United States, should not be a part of that negotiation whatsoever. And that should be over here, phase one. But then phase two of the discussion about security guarantees should be among us, and Vladimir Putin cannot have a voice in that conversation. It is absurd that Mr. Witkoff reported very, with a lot of fanfare, and he seemed very snug and happy with himself, that they discussed security guarantees in Alaska. That is a recipe for disaster. They cannot be a part of that negotiation. Now, I'm 100% with Ivo. The best security guarantee is NATO. History proves that. Russia, the Soviet Union, has never invaded a NATO country. By the way, a NATO country has never invaded Russia or the Soviet Union. So when Putin keeps talking about security guarantees, he should want Ukraine and NATO. It's a win-win for everybody. It's not the way he thinks about it, but that's the way he should think about it. But when that conversation begins, it is just imperative that Putin is not there. Just as Ivo alluded to, 1949, nobody called the Kremlin, nobody called Stalin and said, are you okay with the creation of NATO? Nobody called Khrushchev in 55 and said, are you okay with West Germany joining? Nobody called Moscow, even in the 90s. Boris Yeltsin, President Clinton didn't call him and say, you okay with this? You okay with this? And George W. Bush didn't call Putin to say, are you okay with the expansion of NATO? If we had done that, it would never have led to this fantastic achievement of the expansion of NATO. And those two pieces just have to be separated if there will ever be long-term, credible security guarantees for Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Two voices from diplomacy, representing one branch of government, a different one, someone who happens to be in the room when it happens nowadays. Our next speaker, Jim Rice, is going to give us a perspective from what he's seen when he's visited Ukraine, but also the conversations that are happening in the United States right now. Because as both of our speakers, it doesn't matter as diplomats which side of the aisle you represent the United States when you're overseas. But I can say that of my 14 trips to Ukraine, 10 of them were led by Republicans. So there's a bipartisan consensus about what's happening. And Jim, you can tell us what's happening in Washington right now, perhaps.
Okay, I'll do my best. First of all, I'm very honored to be on this distinguished panel. Ronald Reagan's already been invoked, so I'm not sure what my role is anymore. I was listening to some of the introductory speeches talking about Ukraine's restoration of independence. There's nothing Americans like more than an Independence Day, and some of these Ukraine and other countries in the region are lucky to have more than one. No, that's a joke. They're unfortunate because of their neighbor. They have to constantly reassert independence. But I will say that I think it is a deeply American thing to support independence and countries fighting for liberty. I think in our DNA, we're still the little colonies that are fighting against the British Empire to secure our independence, and I think we have a natural sympathy as Americans toward any country that's fighting for freedom and independence against a big empire. So there's nothing more American than supporting Ukraine, in my view. And also, I think the title of this panel, Peace Through Strength, again, it was a motto that popularized by Ronald Reagan. That is, I think that is the answer to a lot of the world's issues. Senator Grassley wrote a series of speeches, gave a series of speeches, I think, in the last year or so, on the theme of peace through strength. That's the thing about Russia and the Soviet Union, that we keep relearning the lesson that they only understand strength. Putin only understands strength. He's a KGB guy. That was true during the Soviet Union. I would say maybe from a congressional perspective, it does seem, we constantly have presidents that come in and think that they uniquely can, maybe if they just talk to Putin, they can solve it. So, Senator Grassley was elected to the Senate with Ronald Reagan in 1980, and he was in the House before that. So he's seen a lot of presidents come and go. There's almost something structural about, you have 40 years maximum, and so you want to get in there and make your mark, and you think, well, maybe I can solve all the world's problems in this short period of time. That's usually not how it works. We've had presidents come in. George W. Bush famously looked into Putin's eyes and got a sense of his soul, and then was disappointed when Georgia was invaded and Putin was not the partner that was hoped for. And then, 6 months later or so, we had the reset with Russia in the hopes that we could bring them, back around, which I think, again, from Putin's standpoint, that was more a sign of weakness than strength. It was, we were trying to offer an olive branch. That's a very American thing to do. But from his standpoint, I think it seemed like we were, not willing to push back against aggression. And then, Trump came in and thought we could, maybe if I just talk to him, everything will be fine. And he's doing that a second time around. So Biden, I think, wanted to park Russia, was hoping that we could just sort of focus on Asia and maybe Russia wouldn't be a problem. And then I do think the Afghanistan withdrawal. In fact, there's even Miguel Zigar's book says that he has sources from the Kremlin that the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the way it happened, he thought that America was in retreat and that this was the time that Putin could go forward with a full-scale invasion. And so I think, it's not, strength doesn't always, it doesn't always lend itself to a fast solution. I remember hearing people even having personal debates with people saying, well, okay, if we arm Ukraine and we get involved, when will it end? Can you assure me that this will be wrapped up in a year and that we can, what's the end game? You can't predict that. In World War II, we couldn't predict how long it would last. We stayed out a lot longer than probably we should have. We learned lessons after World War I and World War II. We stayed out as long as we could, and I think the lesson we learned after World War II was that we have to stay engaged in Europe to prevent another world war from happening, and we're in the process of unlearning that lesson now, and that's unfortunate. But the answer, I think, is in fact peace through strength.
Thank you, James. And from the other side of this conversation, again on the legislative branch, Jim is working in a legislative branch with a president who believes he's at war, under invasion from the south. We have Sasha working with a president who's actually at war and has a different level of powers as well. So why don't you give us your opening statement, Sasha?
Thank you so much. And when I keep hearing about the security guarantees, the biggest security guarantee for us would be to punch the bully, because so far this has never happened within the first day of the invasion. I will be pessimistic at the beginning, probably a little bit, but the world failed on Ukraine. Ukraine is a great example why the international organizations and diplomacy are not working. Look at the United Nations. You have Russia chairing the United Nations when Ukraine is being bombed. I've recently been to the OSCE meeting because I represent Ukraine at the parliamentary delegation at the OSCE. This is the security organization of Europe. They couldn't, last time we tried to put an amendment to kick out a Russian FSB agent because so the former private interpreter of Putin is at one of the top positions as the secretariat of the OSCE. And when we, as Ukrainians, put up an amendment to kick out that lady, you know what? The majority of the countries did not vote. And when I was turning around to them saying, what's going on? They're like, oh, she's gonna go to court. I'm like, seriously? We're still discussing going to court at the Security Organization of Europe when you have a private interpreter of Putin sitting here working on all of the documents. And it was really ridiculous for me to listen to all of the countries talking about Ukraine, because each one of them was saying we need to do more. So at some point I stood up, and they couldn't tell me anything because I had my 3-year-old with me. And I was like, can we please stop talking about we need to do more and actually start doing more? And can we... And I couldn't understand what they were scared about. So I hope next session we're actually going to kick out that FSB agent. But this is the key reason is everybody is playing by the rules. The rules that were set up after World War II. Putin doesn't. And Ukraine, I think, is the first country who is starting to change the rules. You know, a lot of people in Pentagon and in this country were pissed when we did the operation that put, like the net, that put down a lot of the Russian jets. They were literally scared because we opened the new world and we didn't ask anyone about it. We didn't ask for that support because we've been asking for that support for 3.5 years, for ATACMS, Tomahawks, and when we just decided to do it in our own way. I've recently, last time when I was in Congress, they were passing NDAA. This is the defense budget of the United States. Some of the Congress people were very inspired, and they were telling me that this is for the first time in history that it's officially in NDA that the United States is going to produce 1 million FPV drones next year. I started laughing. They were like, why are you laughing? I'm like, well, we produce like 10 and buy 10 more, and this is nothing comparing to what Russians are doing, and you're telling me the entire United States is going to produce 1 million? What are you going to do with it? Play with the kids? But honestly, this is the problem. Everybody keeps talking while Putin is doing what he wants to do. So coming back to the security guarantees, of course we would love NATO. But when I was 2 days ago driving from Kiev to Warsaw, the #1 news in the Polish media was a Russian Shahid in the Polish airspace for 2.5 hours, a NATO country, and a very well-armed NATO country comparing to, I don't know, like Portugal, right, that has a few tanks. So this is an armed country with a lot of the patriots, I saw them myself, sitting on the border that did not know what to do with one Shahid. They were chasing it for 2.5 hours. And I'm like, so what is NATO? What is the NATO guarantees if the countries themselves cannot protect? And they don't know how to respond. They are scared to respond because then it's escalation. Everybody is scared about escalation. And no matter how, like both administration, this one and the previous one, they were trying to de-escalate or to pretend it doesn't exist and to find an exit plan. Now they have to face the reality because if this war, and I was saying that yesterday, if we had all of the weapons we have now in the country in 2022, this war would be over. Because remember the first counteroffensive? When we got the territories back that were occupied in 2014, that was hitting the bully, and bullies Putin hard. And that's when he freaked out and started calling the White House and trying to set up a separate line for negotiations. The only two differences is this administration is doing it openly, the previous administration was doing it with the back channel. And that was obvious for everyone. And you can read the book called The War. It's about the Ukrainian war and about what was done at the National Security Council back then on Ukraine. And now we can see that the same thing is going on now. I think we as Ukrainians need to start, and we actually started it, and I think Europeans are now leading that, to stop talking about Ukraine as a victim, but to talk of Ukraine as a successor. You know why? Because each country is going to come to us later, and Europeans are doing it already, because we are the only ones who know how to fight, how to produce the drones, how to produce the weapons. And I had a really nice meeting with the new chairman of the Defense Committee of the German Parliament. And he said that we understand that Ukraine is the #1 priority, not for you, but for us. We have Rheinmetall, KMBS, all of the biggest companies already in Ukraine opening factories. And they, this year, put up $7 billion, and they're putting $2 billion extra only for the weapons production. I think the biggest we've had from the United States in terms of weapons, don't count the humanitarian and direct budget investment, was 13. One Germany is doing 9 already. Because they understand this is the future. And he honestly told me, I think in 2 years we will be totally independent with you from the United States. And the United States will be producing 1 million drones still. And this is something we need to think about, and this is how we need to talk to probably this new administration, because we need to stop talking about us being a victim, because this strategy doesn't work. We've been asking for ATACMS for like 2.5 years. We got a few. And when somebody's telling me security guarantees, I'm like, give us a few Tomahawks. No, if you don't give us those, okay, we're just going to produce our own ones. But with this administration, I think the security guarantee should be, they should realize that Ukraine is not a victim, but it's going to be a successor. And it's whether you step with us in this case, and you become a part of this success. And the United States always wanted to back up winners. And they want to learn. And they're trying to learn like through private companies, but it's very complicated when you don't have the support of the United States in the State Department. So I think we just need to understand that we will have these security guarantees in a year or two. It's going to be mainly Europeans paying tons of money. Just for you to understand, Europeans are now paying money for every shipment of the US weapons that has already been paid by the American money. The supplemental that was passed when the Democrats were in power, and that was super helpful back then because that was the only support when Europeans were not sure whether they're going to support or not. Now, when we have the shipments coming, Europeans are paying us. So I don't know how it works in the United States with double payments, but it was kind of a surprise for us. But Europeans are okay with that. And I think at some point, it's for the United States to decide whether the United States wants to stay as the leader and be with those leaders, or they're just going to lose Europe. The biggest problem we have now is the manpower. Because this is our guys fighting there and dying. And this is the problem we need to solve internally, because no one is going to come. They all keep talking about Stammer was sending 30,000 people, Germany was sending some people. I asked the German army at the Munich Security Conference. I thank them for training our guys on their equipment, and this is super helpful because if you're being trained on the Leopard tank, then you take this Leopard tank to your brigade, and it is much easier. But they also do basic trainings for us for 2 months. And I asked one of their top generals, I was like, it's kind of complicated for me to understand why you're training our people, how to run, use the gun, because right now the #1 training should be is how to operate a drone and how to hide from the aviation bomb. I'm like, do you at least have these trainings for your own army? You know what he said? We don't even have the drones to train them on. So when Europe now is starting to understand and sending people to learn from us, I don't still think there is an understanding here. And it's been shifting back and forth. The only good thing that I think happened recently, that changed the paradigm here, at least that's my understanding, is when Putin humiliated President Trump, because right after the negotiations, he started hitting hard on civilians, and they put down one of the biggest factories, the American factories in Ukraine, in Mukachevo. And I think when I was reading one of the last tweets from President Trump saying Ukraine needs to strike back, I was like, yeah, we've been talking about it for 3.5 years. Thank you for telling us. But besides just saying that we need to strike back, can you give us something that we can strike back with? Because that would be super helpful, and that would be a security guarantee. Because that's what you did with Israel, right? When Israel was attacked, all of the Tomahawks and ATACMS landed on Hamas bases. So basically, I think there is a shift. The problem is, how long is it going to take? How long is it going to take for everyone in this administration, in the new administration, to understand that? So I think the security guarantees will be, we can calculate them in the number of the missiles. If not, the security guarantees will be provided by ourselves, together with our partners, built in Ukraine. Because there is no other solution. And there are two ways, whether the United States is going to be the part of it, or whether the United States is going to be out of the big map. And I think we just need to stop thinking about the diplomatic ways and negotiate about starting negotiations, because it just doesn't work. So I think I'll just stop here. I'm sorry for taking a little bit longer, but I do believe that Ukraine will be the security guarantee for everyone, not somebody else for us. Thank you.
Дякую, Саша, дякую. We will try to get a couple of questions in from the audience, but beginning with what Sasha said, we have discussed a lot of things here. We've heard a lot of things from the panelists about what needs to be done, and unfortunately, a lot of the conversation involves people with no understanding about what's happening. So I'm going to put out 3 names to you that have been told to me that are on a wish list of coming to Ukraine by the end of the year. I would like you to respond if you think any of those would come this year or the next. And then what do you foresee as far as visits to Ukraine? In the next panel, we'll have about media. JP will talk about how it was successful to get Ben Shapiro to Ukraine. We've gotten religious leaders. But of Secretary Scott Bessent, Speaker Mike Johnson, or Melania Trump, these are all people who've gotten invitations in one way or another. Who do you foresee coming to Ukraine out of those? Or are there specific people within the cabinet, and especially the executive, that you see coming to Ukraine, not including Marco Rubio? He's been there. So what do we see? The ambassadors, Jim, anybody? Sasha can also tell you about wonderful golf courses that the oligarchs did in the East.
So I'll be very direct.
Yeah.
None of them are going to come. Mm-hmm. The fundamental flaw in this administration's thinking is that this is a war that is over there and it doesn't affect us here. They're wrong,
Yep.
but that's how they think. And just to emphasize Sasha's point, the split between the United States and Europe on this issue is complete, total, and fundamental. The Europeans are still working through their 5 stages of grief. They have been in denial that this administration cares about European security. They have been bargaining with this administration to think about how to deal with European security. They've got quietly angry, they're deeply depressed, but they have not yet accepted the reality that Sasha just laid out. Except that they are starting to. And for someone who was born in Europe and spent most of my adult life here in the United States and represented the greatest transatlantic alliance in the history, in fact, the greatest military alliance in the history of the world, as the U.S. representative, nothing makes me sadder than that fact. But the reality is that this administration believes that America first means America alone. That what happens over there, a war that Europeans are fighting or should be fighting, is of no interest to the United States. And so they're not coming to Ukraine unless there's some business deal to be made that has some transactional relationship to it. But that's not a basis for long-term security. That's a transaction. And if you lose money, you go to the next transaction. By the way, Donald Trump is a master of losing money in transactions. And so that is how far you can get. But we need to wake up. Ukraine has woken up. The Europeans need to wake up that they are on their own. And if they can get some help from the United States, great. But they're not going to get a lot. So I don't think any American official of any standing is going to spend any time in Ukraine because they don't regard it as being in their interest. They're wrong, but it doesn't matter because these people are never wrong.
We have more work to do, everybody, with the invites. Anybody else?
So I guess I'll disagree in that I don't think it's possible to predict what President Trump will do. And, you know, right? I've given up predicting. And I think it's also not right to say that the administration has a very specific, cohesive ideology that they're unwilling to waver from. There are different folks within the administration who have different points of view. So some maybe do have that point of view, others don't. And President Trump could change his mind today, and you know, we could maybe Melania's trip is being planned as we speak. I don't know. I also think if Melania really wants to go, she might just go. So I don't know, and I've met Scott Bessent. I think he is an impressive and level-headed person. I hadn't heard that, that would be great. So I wouldn't rule anything out, but because you never know what event could happen and what President Trump will do at any given time. So.
I think it depends on how it ends. I think it will be, if we hit Moscow hard with one of our new missiles, and when that little bully runs, Trump will come.
Oh, yeah.
He will be there on the first airplane. It was very inspiring for Ukrainians when we had President Biden come. I remember that was a shock. It was in a top secret, but it was like a new inspiration. I think if we are lucky to get a lot of our children back, we might have someone, because this is something that you can show here. It's not about Ukraine, it's about what it is here. But I think, again, about the security guarantees.
Yep.
If we hit Russia hard and put Moscow down, the Kremlin, I think there will be a lot of number one jets in our airspace. Thank you.
Any silver tongues from you, Ambassador McFaul, that you could convince somebody from leadership that if you were in a position, because you've been there, you tried to get, we know President Obama, first president not to go to Ukraine, elected in the United States. What are the effective strategies, whether you're in the Senate, whether you're an advocate, to get somebody to go to Ukraine?
Honestly, I don't have any expertise on that. This panel has more expertise on how to get people to Ukraine. I would just make a broader comment to this community in particular. I agree analytically with what everybody said, and especially what Ivo just said about the facts right now. I keep hopeful, because of the uncertainty of President Trump, that he can change his mind. Most certainly, Putin is making him look weak. He's making him look feckless. And I can't believe that somebody around the president is not explaining that to him, but I don't know this administration well. But I do think we have to continue to play the long game with respect to our relationship, the people of the United States of America, not the Trump administration, with the people of Ukraine. Because I believe it's in our long-term national security interests to be engaged in Europe and not to walk away. We did that before, folks. That's called the 1930s, where people said, oh, war over there, that's not our problem. Where's Poland? Who cares about that? We know how disastrous that ended for our country. So just as an American, thinking about American interests, I think we have a long-term interest in engaging with Ukraine. As other panelists said, Ukraine, right now, your warriors, Sasha, your warriors are the greatest fighting force we have in Europe today. I want to be on the side of that army. I want that army on our side. And I would just point out that we don't have many polls in America where 80% of Americans agree, but 82% of Americans agree that Putin is a bad guy. And we've got to keep working on that in terms of the political dynamics, because if not Trump in the future, this is going to be a long fight, folks. Even if the war ends sometimes, this is going to be a long fight for the future of security and for the future of a democratic and free Ukraine. And so we've got to keep in that fight. Even if you can't convince Melania to come, we, in this community in particular, have to keep fighting for that and make it costly for politicians to ignore this crowd. You have to make it costly for them to ignore you, and I would just encourage you to think more in the long term. There's elections coming up. Donald Trump is not going to be president of the United States forever. That's a prediction I'm going to make. And therefore, we've got to keep at this, to keep reminding Americans why it's the moral thing to do, because there is evil in the world, there is good in the world, and we want our country to be on the side of good and against evil, but it's also in our long-term national security interests.
Sasha.
If I may add, because I completely agree with what Ambassador McFaul was just saying, and we need to think long-term. So maybe we should start thinking about bringing governors Because one of those might be the next American president. And you know, when I was looking at the at the map of Ukraine, and because I've spent a lot of my personal time in Austin, Texas, or Dallas. I went to high school in Texas, and then spent a lot of time after the war broke. Well, Ukraine is kind of matching Texas. So this is, no, I'm serious. So we keep saying that Ukraine is the Texas of Europe. And I think this is what Trump needs to understand, because we've heard a lot of statements, especially on geopolitics, that were surprising for us. But I think if we start bringing the governors, people who are actually gods in their own regions, that would be something that can influence the next elections, because one of those might be the next president or the next vice president of the United States.
It's a very good strategy that's been tried for many years. I remember meeting with Chris Christie's staff before the 2012 elections, and not 2012, sorry, to 2020 elections. And, you know, you can just put your foot into Ukraine by going to Yavoril, back when that was an active thing. You have Kasha with the soldiers. You're fantastic on foreign policy. There you go as a governor. But as we've heard, people are scared of doing that. Whether it's because it's far away, not so much the security issue. I think even more so, Sasha, than President Biden's trip, it was Dr. Jill Biden's trip, where we got to embarrass members of Congress who were too scared. I'm like, the First Lady just went to Uzhhorod, come on. I have a couple of questions from the audience. One that goes for everybody and that has been talked about here. Sasha's talking about security guarantees. The ambassador just mentioned that the war is going to go on for a long time. Let's say that it's not a diplomat. Let's say that it's not a security consultant. Let's say it's Vladimir Putin that falls out a window. Does the war end? No. Why doesn't it end? And what would be the next steps after a change? I think most people, if you've gone to Ukrainian school, you know that the Mongol invasion of Ukraine happened when Aga Khan passed away and everybody had to go back for the funeral. That's not going to happen this time. We already have people on the ground. So the question is from the audience, if Putin were to fall out a window, does the war end? Why not? And then what are the foreseeable next steps? Who wants to start? Do you want to start from Sasha?
This is the biggest threat right now that we are facing in Europe, and I think it's kind of moving to the United States. It's called good Russians.
Yes.
I'm sorry, a good Russian is a dead Russian. And this is not Putin's war, it's Russian war. The majority of Russians support the invasion of Ukraine. And this is a big difference between Belarus and Russia, because Belarus, if you see the polls, the majority of people do not support. They're scared to death to stand up and talk about it, even though we have separate battalions of Belarusians fighting against the Russians. But Russians literally support it. And let's be honest, a lot of Ukrainians have relatives in Russia. I do. My mother's sister lives in Moscow. I have 2 cousins there. You know what? We never talk. And I've never seen my mom, my 75-year-old mom, being so mad and say, I'm not going to repeat the words she said to her sister when my hometown was attacked, but that was their last conversation. Because she was trying to explain her, like literally to her sister, that if we wouldn't invade, then you would have invaded Russia with Americans. They honestly believe in that. And those are people with high education that has been abroad a lot. And this is the worst thing, because this is what our kidnapped children are being taught in Russian schools. They're being taught when we bring them back that this is Americans with Ukrainians fighting against Russia. And they had to do that not to be invaded first. So we need to stop, and this is a threat that I see in Europe, because when you go to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, when you go to OSCE, you see a lot of these opposition leaders coming, talking, or protesting on the streets of Berlin. I'm like, what are you doing in Berlin? You want to protest? Go to Moscow and protest there. You have full support here. If you want to change your country and you're against, well, you have to go there. You know what they're telling us? Oh, we're going to be put in prison or die. I'm like, guess what? That's what happened to us, and we're dying. And in 2014 at Maidan, when I was standing there, that was for the first time when I, as an adult, cried because I was scared. Because I literally understood that I could have been put in jail for 15 years or shot to death. But we had to do that. And actually, I still remember this is one of the lections that I just realized. When Ambassador McFaul was my professor, I remember when you were talking about Bolotne, because this is when Putin changed. And I remember how he emphasized that if back then Russians didn't fail and didn't run, we might have had a different Russia and a different world. But there were two mistakes that were done when Nemtsov was not selected and then when Bolotnaya happened. But there is a different Russia now, and I don't know how many years it needs to take to change those people. But even if he falls out tomorrow of a window, it's not gonna change unless you have a new dictator coming and saying, oh, we're like changing the strategy. But I don't believe in that.
Anybody else about a post-Putin Russia?
I mean, so one thing is if Putin hasn't, as far as we know, he's reluctant to have a successor because there can only be one czar at a time, and so there would be a scramble for leadership, and so chaos within Russia would be helpful. So it could lead to, without the top-down leadership, maybe Ukraine could make some more gains, or there would be some disruption. It would be good. But there's certainly, I think, Russia's going to keep trying to take Ukraine until they are soundly defeated. I think that imperial mentality that Russians have sort of imbued, that has to be disabused, and I think the really only way to do that is for them to feel a crushing defeat and realize they can't have an empire, and that there's no guarantee that will happen if Russia is defeated, but the only way it could happen is if Russia is soundly defeated. So I guess it gets back to the peace through strength. I don't think you can't have a long-term peace through negotiations or some sort of, even if there was a disruption in Russia where they had to pause the war while they figure out their leadership struggle, at the end of the day, the only long-term solution, I think, is a sound defeat where Russia has to accept, kind of like Germany after World War II, like they didn't after World War I, accepts that they're not an empire, they don't have a right to take over their neighbors. And that's a cultural thing that does have to go all the way through society. It's not about a top-down thing.
Yes.
Could I add to that? So I want to add to it by telling two stories. One is that a few months ago, we hosted for dinner at my house President Yushchenko. He was in town. His daughter goes to Stanford, by the way. She's a student of ours. And the question of, are there any good Russians, came up. Sasha, and you need to know that your former president said, yes, there was one. And he said, Boris Nemtsov, who was later assassinated in 2015. And Boris was actually a friend of mine. And he explained why. And Boris actually used to say this when I would meet with him. He said, because Boris understood that the way to defeat Russian imperialism, to your point, of course, if he can defeat it on the battlefield, and that's the best, but the real threat that Putin faces from Ukraine is a free Ukraine, a democratic Ukraine, a prosperous Ukraine. And Nemtsov used to always say to me when I was in the government, with all due respect, you Americans, you have no ability to affect domestic politics in Russia, so stop it. Put all of your resources into Ukraine. Because the greatest threat to Putin is a thriving market economy, a thriving democracy in Ukraine. So that's the first story I wanted to tell you. The second story I want to tell you was from 2011. I was working at the White House, and we traveled there we were trying to seek, and we achieved it, by the way. People forget there was some things we did that was good, I think, for American national interests in the world. Where we got the Russians to stand aside and let us stop the killing in Benghazi. This was in 2011 in Libya. And we met with Vladimir Putin. He was the prime minister. I was traveling with Vice President Biden at the time. And at one point, Putin, I'm not going to go through all the weird things he does and the weird ways he sits, but he looked at, can you be the vice president? I'll be Putin. And I'm not going to sit like him, but you can look at the photos. You know how he does. And he stares, first of all. He doesn't blink. And he looked at Vice President Biden. He said, you know what your problem is? You guys look at us, and you see our skin. He went just like this. You look at us, and we look like you. And you think because we look like you, because we look like you, we think like you. But we don't. We and I, we're different. We're different from you. And a point he was trying to make is that, and then the other thing he says, to add to that, and I've heard him say this, Ukrainians aren't a separate nation. All this history that you guys are talking about, that's complete nonsense. Ukrainians are just Russians with accents. That's what he says, more or less. That's what he says. That's his worldview. And that, if you have that worldview, and then those Russians with accents are living in a free, independent country, are practicing democracy, that is the real threat to Putin. It is not NATO expansion. It is democracy in Ukraine. So the long haul that I'm talking about is hopefully, hopefully there'll be the end of this war, but the long haul for defeating Russia and defeating that mentality that you're talking about is a vibrant Ukrainian democracy. And that is a struggle that we're going to be in for a long time, and we've got to be in it together.
I just want to say one thing, which is whatever happens afterwards, I don't think anybody will cry if he falls out of a window.
At the very least, we'll have your interpretation of him as a reminder. As I was sitting next to Gandalf at the United Nations just a couple of months after he was released, our favorite thing to needle the ambassadors were constantly referring it to the northern state, soon to be formerly known as Russia. Because as we know, there will only be an end to this when there is no more existence of what currently is an imperial state. Currently, like Sasha said, Bolotnaya is 2012. It's not that it changed in 2022. It changed every year thereafter. Ladies and gentlemen, I've received a lot of questions, some of which are very good actually for other panels. So because the best part of these experiences when we gather in person is to actually come up to these people, we're going to release them from their panel. We're going to make sure that everybody gets kava, because why have a conversation if we can't sit down with some coffee with people? And then we're going to clear out for the next panel. The next panel will begin in approximately 5 to 10 minutes. So why don't we have a big round of applause for all of our speakers. And let's try to take everything that we learned today for all the street corners. We're going to be talking to different members of the press in the future months. A lot of good talking points. Thank you very much.